My name is Scarlett. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words people think are compliments: steady, reasonable, low maintenance, the kind of woman who doesn't take up much space, the kind who can be trusted to handle things quietly. I live a fairly ordinary life: work that looks unremarkable from the outside, a marriage that appeared stable enough, a routine that didn't raise questions. If you asked people who knew me casually, they'd probably say I was lucky, calm, put together, someone who didn't need much. What most people never notice is that being underestimated can feel very similar to being invisible. I've always been observant. I listen more than I speak. I don't interrupt, I don't escalate. That's often mistaken for softness or passivity or a lack of depth. In reality, it's how I survive. It's how I make sense of people. And eventually, it's how I learn the truth about my own life. This story is not about revenge. It's not about dramatic confrontations or sudden transformations. There's no shouting match, no cinematic villain, no moment where everyone applauds at the end. It's about something much quieter, and I think much more unsettling. It's about the moment I realized that my life had been discussed, evaluated, and quietly decided upon without me in the room. I agreed to a surgery, believing it was a shared decision, one made with care and mutual trust. I woke up to discover that, behind my back, a do-not-resuscitate order had been signed in my name. Not by a stranger, by the person who was supposed to protect me when I couldn't speak for myself. I survived the operation. But what I woke up to was not relief. It was clarity. The kind that rearranges everything you thought you understood about love, safety, and your own value. This story follows what happened before that day and everything that happened after. It's about the small dismissals that seem harmless in isolation, the roles we're quietly assigned when we're dependable and agreeable, the way silence can be mistaken for consent, and the moment when silence stops being an absence and becomes a choice. I'm telling this in my own words without exaggeration because I think many people, especially women, recognize pieces of themselves in stories like this, even if the details are different. I'm not here to paint anyone as a monster. I'm here to tell the truth as accurately as I can remember it, and to let you decide what it means. If you've ever sensed that your presence in a relationship felt conditional, useful, but replaceable, I want you to listen closely. And as you do, I want to ask you something gently before we begin. Have you ever realized too late that people were making decisions about you instead of with you? Before anything went wrong, before hospitals and paperwork and quiet realizations, I was useful. That's the simplest way to describe who I was to the people around me. Not adored, not centered, useful. I was the person who remembered birthdays without reminders, the one who filled out forms correctly the first time, the one who noticed when the insurance letter didn't look quite right, when a bill had an extra charge, when a conversation shifted just slightly in tone. I handled logistics. I handled transitions. I handled discomfort so other people didn't have to. At work, I was reliable Scarlett. Not ambitious in a threatening way. Not emotional. Someone managers trusted to keep things running smoothly, but never felt the need to publicly acknowledge. I wasn't the visionary or the fire starter. I was the one who made sure the lights stayed on while everyone else talked about ideas. At home, it was similar. My spouse often described me as easy to be with, low drama, understanding, flexible. When decisions came up, where to live, whose career took priority, which holidays we traveled for, I was the one who said, "We can figure it out." And because I said it calmly, because I didn't protest loudly, those decisions slowly stopped feeling like discussions at all. I don't say that with bitterness. At the time, it felt like maturity, partnership, compromise. People like me are rarely accused of being difficult. We're praised for being reasonable. But reasonableness, I learned later, can be a very convenient disguise for erasure. In social settings, I was often physically present and conversationally optional. Someone might ask my opinion after everyone else had spoken, as if remembering me at the end of a list. If I disagreed gently, it was often smoothed over with a laugh or reframed as me not really minding either way. And because I didn't correct them, because correcting people requires energy, I became, in their minds, someone without strong edges, someone whose inner world was assumed to be mild simply because it was quiet. The truth was, I noticed everything. I noticed how decisions were summarized to me after they'd already been made, how concern for my well-being was expressed in abstract language, "This is probably for the best," or "You'll be okay with this, right?" Rather than direct questions. I noticed how often my consent was implied instead of requested. But I also noticed how comfortable people were when I didn't resist. There's a particular safety others feel around someone who absorbs friction. I provided that safety. I made life smoother for everyone else, and in return, I was trusted to carry more than my share quietly. My spouse relied on me in ways that looked like intimacy from the outside. I was consulted about schedules, logistics, and appearances. But there was a line, thin, invisible, that I didn't realize existed until much later. On one side of that line were discussions, on the other were decisions that, apparently, didn't require me to be fully awake, fully informed, or fully present. At the time, I would have said we were a team. If someone had asked me then whether I felt respected, I might have paused, searching for the right word. I would have said I felt considered, included enough, safe enough. But respect, I've since learned, is not about how gently someone speaks to you. It's about whether they believe your agency matters when it's inconvenient. Back then, I didn't yet understand that being seen as calm can cause people to forget you're sentient. That being dependable can lead others to assume you'll endure anything, as long as it's framed as practical. So, this was who I was to them, the steady background presence, the reasonable one, the woman who didn't need much explanation. And because I played that role well, because I didn't challenge it, I was trusted with responsibility, but not with power, included in outcomes, but not always in choices. I didn't feel wronged. I didn't feel alarmed. I felt settled into. And that, I realize now, was the most dangerous part. The first moment I remember clearly doesn't look important on its own. That's why it stayed with me. It happened months before the surgery, during an appointment that was supposed to be routine, a follow-up consultation. Fluorescent lights, laminated pamphlets, a chair that never quite sits level. I had taken the afternoon off work, rearranged my schedule, and done all the preparatory reading. My spouse came with me, which felt supportive at the time. The doctor spoke quickly, efficient, confident. He used words like low risk and standard procedure. He directed most of his explanations toward my spouse, not intentionally rude, just angled that way. When I asked a question, the answer came back shorter, simplified, as if translated. At one point, the doctor mentioned a consent form that would be finalized later. "Nothing urgent," he said. "We'll handle the details closer to the date." My spouse nodded before I did. That was the first cut. Small, almost polite. It wasn't the content of the conversation. It was the rhythm. The way the agreement happened around me was slightly faster than I could step into it. The way my silence was interpreted as alignment, not contemplation. On the drive home, I mentioned it. Not accusingly, just observational. "I felt like the conversation moved a little fast," I said. "Like things were already decided." My spouse laughed softly, eyes still on the road. "That's just how doctors are. You worry too much." That sentence landed gently, almost reassuring, almost dismissive. And because it was delivered with familiarity, because it wasn't cruel, I let it pass. I told myself I was being sensitive, that my discomfort was about fear, not substance. But something had shifted. After that, small things began to stack. Conversations are summarized instead of shared. Appointments were scheduled and then confirmed to me afterward. When I asked for clarification, I was told, "It's nothing you need to stress about." Stress, that word became a soft barrier. Any question I asked that slowed things down could be filed under stress. And because I was known as someone who handled stress well, the implication was that I shouldn't create more of it. Friends noticed nothing. The family noticed nothing. From the outside, everything looked normal. Supportive spouse, proactive healthcare, a calm plan in place. I noticed the shift in language. We stopped saying, "What do you think?" and started saying, "The plan is." We stopped discussing possibilities and started discussing timelines. And each time I hesitated, the hesitation was treated as emotional noise, not relevant input. The most unsettling part wasn't being overruled. It was being preempted. There's a particular loneliness in realizing that people believe they already know your answer, that they've decided your boundaries based on past compliance. I had built a reputation for being agreeable. Now it was being used as a shortcut. One evening, I asked directly, "Can we slow this down? I want to understand every document before anything is signed." My spouse looked genuinely surprised, not angry, confused. "Of course," they said, "but you trust me, right?" That question wasn't a threat. It was an assumption disguised as reassurance. And I felt for the first time that trust was being positioned opposite to agency, as if wanting information meant withholding faith. I said yes, I shouldn't have, but I did. Not because I lacked intuition, but because intuition without evidence is easy to doubt. And at that point, I had only a feeling, a sense of being edged out of my own story. So I did what I'd always done. I took notes, mental at first, then literal, dates, phrases, who said what, and when. Not because I was planning anything, just because something in me needed to stay awake. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't bruise. It didn't change anything on the surface. But it taught me something vital. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in efficiency, reassurance, and a smile that says, "Don't worry, we've got this." Everyone else forgot that moment. I didn't. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic followed. And that was precisely how it worked. Life continued in a way that looked functional, even considerate. Appointments were kept, meals were planned, conversations stayed calm. If anything, my spouse seemed more attentive, checking in, reminding me to rest, speaking in that careful tone people use when they believe they're being supportive. But something subtle had changed in how my presence was weighted. I began to notice that my questions were answered before they were finished. That was when I paused, thinking someone else would fill the space for me, not maliciously, efficiently, as if silence were a problem that needed solving. The word "we" was still used, but it started to mean something different. We've decided this is the best option. We talked it through with the doctor. We're comfortable with the risk. I was included linguistically, but not practically. At first, I pushed back in small ways. I asked for copies of documents. I requested to be CC'd on emails. I wanted to attend every appointment, even the administrative ones. None of these requests was denied outright. They were deprioritized. "Oh, I already handled that. They said it wasn't necessary. We can go over it later." Later became a moving target. And because I wasn't being blocked, just delayed, it was easy to convince myself that nothing was wrong, that this was simply how medical systems worked, that my spouse was taking the initiative to protect me from overload. I told myself this was care, not control. There's a dangerous comfort in rationalizing behavior that doesn't quite sit right, especially when the person involved has never raised their voice, never insulted you, never done anything you could clearly point to and say, "This is wrong." So I adapted. I stopped asking questions in the moment and started writing them down. I listened more carefully to phrasing. I noticed how often my consent was inferred based on past behavior rather than present confirmation. When someone says, "You'll be okay with this," what they're really saying is, "You usually are." And I had usually been. That was my mistake. I began to understand that patterns don't need intensity to be harmful. They just need repetition, a steady erosion of expectation, a quiet training of everyone involved, including me. My spouse didn't become cruel. They became confident. Confident that they knew what I needed. Confident that my role was to adapt. Confident that silence meant agreement. And I participated in that confidence by staying calm. Friends praised my strength. Doctors praised my composure. Everyone seemed relieved that I wasn't difficult. No one asked whether I felt fully informed. No one checked whether I felt included. Because from the outside, I looked cooperative. I looked fine. Inside, something else was happening. I began to feel like a passenger in conversations about my own body, not excluded entirely, but buffered, filtered, protected in a way that felt infantilizing. The most unsettling moments were the ones where I caught myself explaining my own thoughts away. "They're just trying to help. I don't want to be a burden. This isn't the hill to die on." That last one would later haunt me. There's a particular kind of self-betrayal that happens when you confuse peace with silence, when you equate being easy to live with as being loved. I didn't want conflict. I didn't want to be seen as ungrateful. I didn't want to seem paranoid. So I normalized the feeling of being slightly out of sync with decisions that affected me directly. I told myself I would speak up if it really mattered. But how do you define really when the stakes increase gradually? Each step felt only slightly more dismissive than the last. Easy to excuse, easy to absorb, like adjusting to a dimmer room. You don't notice how dark it's become until you can't see your own hands. By the time the surgery date was scheduled, I realized something unsettling. I was expected to comply, not to consent. Consent requires presence. It requires a pause. It requires the possibility of no. I hadn't said no, but I also hadn't been asked in a way that made me feel available. And so disrespect became normalized. Not because anyone declared it acceptable, but because everyone learned that I would tolerate it quietly, including me. By the time I understood the role I'd been given, I had already been playing it for years. I was the responsible one, the composed one, the woman who didn't need hand-holding or reassurance because she was strong like that. That identity followed me everywhere, into waiting rooms, into conversations, into decisions that were framed as practical rather than personal. It wasn't something anyone announced. Roles like this never are. They're implied through repetition, through expectation, through the absence of resistance. When plans were made, I was expected to adapt. When complications arose, I was expected to endure. When clarity was needed, I was expected to trust. And when things became serious, medically serious, I was expected to step aside emotionally and let others handle it. I remember a moment that crystallized this for me. We were sitting at the kitchen table, paperwork spread out between us, consent forms, insurance summaries, and post-op care instructions. My spouse was walking me through what had already been reviewed with the hospital. They spoke carefully, gently, like someone explaining something to a child who might get overwhelmed. When I asked a detailed question about risk percentages, about contingencies, the answer came with a reassuring smile and a phrase I'd come to recognize. You don't need to worry about that part. That part, as if my body could be divided into zones of relevance. I realized then that my role wasn't to decide, it was to comply calmly, to be brave in the approved way, to reassure others with my steadiness so they didn't have to confront their own discomfort. I was there to make the process smoother, for doctors, for administrators, for my spouse. I was not there to complicate things with autonomy. And the worst part? I had helped create this version of myself. I had trained people to see me as someone who could be counted on not to react, not to panic, not to demand too much space. I had made myself convenient. There's a cost to being convenient that no one warns you about. Eventually, people stop checking whether you're okay with being used that way. They assume you are. I saw it in the way decisions were narrated to me instead of discussed, in the way my fears were reframed as nerves, in the way my silence was interpreted as strength. Even my vulnerability was managed. When I admitted I was scared, it was met with encouragement, not curiosity. You'll get through this. You're tougher than you think. No one asked what I was afraid of specifically. Fear, in this role, was something to overcome, not explore. So I learned to perform courage. I nodded. I listened. I smiled when appropriate. I reassured people who were supposed to be reassuring me. And in doing so, I became the kind of person others felt comfortable making decisions for. I don't believe my spouse woke up one day and thought, I will take her agency. I believe they slowly learned that I would not contest it, that I trusted systems, that I trusted them, that I would accept outcomes as long as they were framed as reasonable. That's how roles solidify, not through cruelty, but through assumption. I was the reliable wife, the sensible patient, the low-risk variable. No one thought to ask me what I wanted if things went wrong, because in their minds, I wasn't someone who made things difficult. I was someone who endured. It's a strange realization, to see yourself through the expectations of others and recognize how small your designated space has become. I didn't feel angry yet. I felt displaced, like I'd been quietly reassigned in my own life. And somewhere beneath the calm, beneath the cooperation, a question began to form. Soft at first, but persistent. If my role is to be strong and silent, who is making the decisions when I can no longer speak? The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no dramatic discovery. It happened on an ordinary afternoon in a place designed to feel neutral. I was alone in a hospital hallway, waiting for a pre-op assessment. The chairs were lined up neatly, the walls painted in that soft, reassuring color meant to calm you without drawing attention to itself. I remember watching a nurse adjust a clipboard, aligning it carefully with the edge of the desk. Everything looked controlled, managed. I had time. Too much of it. For the first time since the process began, no one was speaking for me. No one was summarizing or translating. It was just me and the weight of what was about to happen. I realized then that I couldn't clearly recall the last time someone had asked me a direct, unhurried question about my wishes. Not about logistics, not about recovery time, about me. What do you want if this goes wrong? What matters to you if you can't speak? The questions rose uninvited, and once they were there, they wouldn't leave. I thought about how often I'd been praised for being calm. How often had that calm been used to smooth over my discomfort? I thought about the forms I hadn't seen yet, the signatures I hadn't personally placed, the decisions I had assumed were mutual. And for the first time, I didn't push the unease away. I let it sit. There's a difference between fear and clarity. Fear makes you reactive. Clarity makes you still. What settled over me in that hallway wasn't panic, it was focus. I understood something fundamental. I had been present for this process, but I had not been central to it. I had trusted that my interests were aligned with the decisions being made. But alignment is not the same as consent, and trust, I realized, should never replace verification. When the nurse finally called my name, I stood up with a strange sense of calm. Not the performative calm people expected from me, but something quieter, heavier. During the assessment, I asked questions, slowly, precisely. I asked what documents existed beyond the ones I'd seen. I asked who would be authorized to make decisions if I couldn't. I asked what protocols were standard and which were optional. The nurse answered kindly but cautiously. Some things, she said, were handled through the hospital. Some were managed through family. Some depended on prior directives. Do you have an advance directive on file? She asked. I said no. That was the moment something inside me clicked into place. Not an alarm, not anger. Responsibility. I realized I had outsourced too much of my authority to assumptions. About love, about partnership, about being known. I had believed that because I was close to someone, my voice would automatically be represented. But proximity does not guarantee advocacy. I went home that day and didn't say anything about the questions I'd asked. Not yet. Instead, I listened more carefully than ever. I paid attention to how decisions were referenced, to what was shared voluntarily and what wasn't. And I stopped filling in the gaps for other people. When silence appeared, I let it stay. That was the shift. Silence, for me, had always been a way to keep the peace. Now it has become a way to observe. I began to see how often people assumed they knew what I wanted, how rarely they checked, how comfortable they were moving forward without explicit confirmation. And instead of correcting them, I took note. I didn't confront, I didn't accuse, I didn't change my demeanor. I changed my orientation, from participant to witness, from absorber to recorder. Something inside me had recalibrated. I was no longer trying to be understood. I was trying to understand accurately. That day in the hallway didn't make me suspicious. It made me precise. And precision, I would learn, is far more powerful than panic. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been automatic, an instinctive smoothing of edges, a way to keep things moving without friction. Now it was deliberate, measured, a pause with intention behind it. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't need to. From the outside, nothing about me appeared different. I was still calm, still agreeable, still the person people felt comfortable speaking to. But internally, I had stopped offering myself as a buffer. When plans were discussed, I listened without interrupting. When conclusions were presented, I didn't rush to affirm them. I allowed moments of discomfort to stretch just a little longer than usual, and in those stretched moments, people revealed more than they intended. They revealed what they assumed I would accept. They revealed what they thought didn't require my input. They revealed how thoroughly my compliance had been factored into their decision-making. My spouse in particular mistook my silence for trust. "You're being so strong about all this, they said one evening, squeezing my hand. "I know it's not easy." I nodded. I didn't correct them. Strength, in their mind, still meant endurance. It still meant not complicating things with questions. So I let them believe that was who I was. Meanwhile, I started doing something I had never done before. I verified everything independently. I requested copies of every document I was legally entitled to. Not urgently, not emotionally, casually, as if for my own records. I read the hospital policy late at night. I looked up the differences between consent, authorization, and advance directives. I learned which forms could be signed by whom, under what circumstances, and with how much discretion. And I didn't share this with anyone, not because I was being secretive, but because clarity doesn't need an audience. The more I learned, the more I understood how easily silence can be interpreted as permission, especially when paired with a history of cooperation. There is a particular danger in being known as reasonable. People stop explaining themselves to you. They stop justifying. They move directly to outcomes. And I had benefited from that reputation for years. Now I was watching it work against me. What surprised me most was how little resistance I encountered. I expected pushback when I asked for documents. I expected defensiveness when I asked procedural questions. Instead, I was met with ease, because no one believed I was preparing for anything. They believed I was calming myself, educating myself, coping. Silence, it turns out, is often mistaken for acceptance. especially when it arrives wrapped in politeness. I let that misinterpretation stand. I stopped reassuring others about how fine I was. I stopped filling conversational gaps with comfort. When someone said, "You're okay with this, right?" I paused before answering. That pause did something interesting. People rushed to fill it. They explained more. They justified. They revealed their reasoning. And in doing so, they showed me exactly where they believed my limits were. I wasn't gathering ammunition. I wasn't planning retaliation. I was mapping reality. And the map was becoming very clear. My silence wasn't passive anymore. It was observational, strategic, protective. I was no longer interested in being perceived as easy. I was interested in being accurate. The irony is that no one noticed the change. When you've been quiet for a long time, people don't register when the quiet becomes intentional. They assume you're still the same. And that assumption gave me space. Space to learn, space to prepare, space to decide what mattered to me before someone else decided it for me. By the time the surgery date approached, I was no longer afraid. Not because I trusted the process, but because I finally understood it. And understanding, I realized, is the first step toward reclaiming agency. What they never noticed was how much information travels when you stop reacting. Once I stopped signaling comfort or discomfort, people spoke more freely around me. They assumed my silence meant I was settled, that I was no longer anxious, that whatever concerns I'd had were now resolved internally. In reality, I was listening more carefully than I ever had. I noticed how often conversations happened adjacent to me instead of with me, how plans were referenced casually, as if I already knew the details, how my name appeared on documents I hadn't personally reviewed, attached to decisions I hadn't explicitly approved. No one hid this from me. They didn't need to, because no one believed I was paying attention. I began keeping my notebook with me at all times, slim, unassuming, black leather. It looked like something I might use for grocery lists or work reminders. No one ever asked about it. Inside, I recorded dates, names, language, not interpretations, facts. March 3rd. Appointment scheduled without prior discussion. March 11th. "You'll be okay with this" is used instead of a question. March 18th. Form referenced, "I have not seen." I didn't write emotionally, I wrote clinically. Precision matters when memory is later challenged. At night, while my spouse slept, I read. I learned how hospitals default to next of kin authority in the absence of explicit directives. I learned how broad that authority could be, how much discretion is allowed, how often it was assumed to be aligned with the patient's wishes, simply because no alternative had been documented. I learned that being married meant being represented, but not necessarily accurately. That distinction stayed with me. I requested my medical records directly, not all at once, piece by piece, framed as curiosity, as preparation. No one resisted. Why would they? I was still calm, still compliant, still strong. I noticed how quickly people grew comfortable speaking in front of me again, how they stopped filtering, how they referenced contingency plans in abstract terms, if things don't go as expected, without ever asking me what expected meant to me. One afternoon, I overheard a phone call I wasn't meant to participate in, not because it was hidden, but because my presence wasn't considered relevant. My spouse was speaking to someone from the hospital, voice low, measured. They were discussing authorization, decision-making, hypotheticals. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react. I simply listened. That conversation confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. People believed they were acting in my best interest, but based on their definition of what my life was worth enduring. Quality of life, burden, probability, words that sound neutral until you realize who is doing the weighing. They never noticed how still I became afterward, how my questions stopped entirely, how I didn't seek reassurance anymore. They mistook my quiet for peace. In reality, I was assembling a complete picture. I understood now that preparation didn't require confrontation. It required patience, documentation, a willingness to let others underestimate you long enough to reveal the full shape of their assumptions. I wasn't angry. Anger clouds judgment. I wasn't scared. Fear rushes decisions. I was focused. There is a particular power in being underestimated while you are fully awake, in being seen as passive while you are actively choosing your next steps. I began to understand that my leverage didn't come from force or threat. It came from alignment, with reality, with process, with timing. And timing, I was learning, mattered more than anything. What they never noticed was that I had stopped trusting intention and started trusting structure, that I no longer relied on what people said they would do, but on what systems allowed them to do. By the time the surgery consent paperwork was finalized, I knew exactly where the gaps were, and I knew exactly what could happen inside them. Still, I said nothing, because knowing is not the same as acting, and I wasn't ready to act yet. The reveal didn't come with a sound. No gasp, no sharp inhale, no moment where I had to sit down. It arrived the way truth often does when you're finally prepared for it. Quietly, almost politely, as if it had been waiting for me to catch up. I was reviewing a section of my medical file late one night, scrolling slowly, carefully. This wasn't new territory anymore. I knew how these documents were structured, where to look, what language mattered. That was when I saw it. Not highlighted, not flagged, just there. An advanced directive form. Incomplete in some sections, completed in others. Not in my handwriting. At first, I assumed I was misreading it, that it was a draft, a placeholder, something administrative that hadn't been finalized. But the signatures were clear. The authorization wasn't mine, and the date told me everything. It had been filed weeks earlier, after I'd asked to slow things down, after I'd asked to see documents before anything was signed, after I had been physically present but procedurally absent. I read the form 3 times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to be absolutely certain of what it meant. A do-not-resuscitate order, quietly executed, legally valid, filed without my direct consent. I didn't cry. I didn't feel betrayed in the dramatic sense people expect. There was no rush of emotion demanding release. What I felt was something colder and far more stabilizing. Recognition. This was the logical conclusion of everything I had observed, the final expression of the role I'd been assigned. I was someone whose life could be evaluated, weighed, and conditionally preserved by someone else. And that decision had been made not in panic, not in crisis, but in advance, calmly, rationally, as part of a plan. I sat with that realization for a long time. I thought about all the moments I'd been told not to worry, all the times my questions had been softened away, all the trust I'd extended was based on proximity rather than proof. And I understood with startling clarity that this wasn't about malice. It was about authority. Someone had believed they had the right to decide when my life stopped being worth intervening for, and they believed I would accept that. That belief, that assumption, was the real reveal. I closed the file. I didn't confront anyone. Not that night, not the next morning. I made tea, I washed the mug, I went to bed. Because the most important part of that discovery wasn't emotional, it was strategic. I now knew exactly where the line had been crossed. And because it had been crossed quietly, I could respond the same way. I consulted no one immediately. I didn't seek validation. I didn't ask friends what they would do. I didn't need opinions. I needed alignment. I reviewed the form again the next day, this time focusing on what it allowed and what it didn't. I noted the witnesses, the scope, the assumptions it relied on. I learned something crucial. The document's power existed because of my silence, not because of my agreement. And silence, once chosen, could also be withdrawn. This wasn't a moment for outrage. Outrage would have exposed me too early. It would have shifted the dynamic before I was ready. Instead, I let the knowledge settle. There is a strange peace that comes when ambiguity ends. When you no longer wonder whether something is wrong, you know. The confusion evaporates. What remains is choice. I didn't yet know exactly what I would do, but I knew what I would never do again. I would never allow my presence to be mistaken for consent. I would never assume that love automatically translates into advocacy. And I would never again let someone else define the value of my continued existence without my explicit voice on record. The reveal wasn't shocking. It was clarifying. And clarity, once achieved, is irreversible. Once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. The days after the discovery moved slowly, but my mind did not. I walked through ordinary routines, work, meals, conversations, as if nothing had changed. From the outside, I was still the same composed woman preparing for surgery. Inside, I was standing at a crossroads I hadn't known existed. There were options. I could feel them branching quietly in front of me. I could confront my spouse immediately, ask why, demand explanations, force the issue into the open, and let emotion do what emotion always does: ignite, blur, escalate. I could cancel the surgery, pull away abruptly, turn fear into distance, and call it self-preservation. I could do nothing. Let the system proceed as designed, trusting that survival would render the document irrelevant. Each option came with consequences. I weighed them carefully. Confrontation would give me answers, but it would also give something else away: my timing. Once exposed, the dynamic would shift. Defensiveness would enter the room. Explanations would be rehearsed. Justifications would replace honesty. Canceling the surgery would protect my body in the short term, but it would leave the underlying structure intact. The assumptions, the authority, the quiet belief that my role was to endure rather than decide. Doing nothing would be the easiest path and the most dangerous, because it would confirm, without words, that my silence could still be interpreted as permission. I realized then that this wasn't just about the document. It was about authorship. Who had the final word when my voice was absent? And more importantly, why had I allowed that question to remain unanswered for so long? The irreversible choice wasn't about punishment or exposure. It wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming authorship in a way that couldn't be undone by emotion, argument, or reinterpretation. I chose structure over reaction. Quietly, I began the process of creating my own advance directive. Not the one assumed, not the one inferred, one that was explicit, detailed, and legally unambiguous. I specified conditions, I named the decision makers, I drew lines that could not be crossed without violating clear instructions. And crucially, I did not assign that authority to the person who had already demonstrated a willingness to decide without me. That was the irreversible part, not because it was cruel, but because it acknowledged reality. Trust, once broken at the level of life and death, cannot be repaired with conversation alone. I didn't inform my spouse immediately, not because I was hiding, but because this wasn't a negotiation. It was a correction. I filed the document myself. I ensured it was recorded properly. I confirmed receipt. I asked the questions I now knew how to ask. Each step was calm, administrative, almost boring. And yet, with each signature, something inside me settled into place. I wasn't severing the relationship. I wasn't creating a scene. I was removing ambiguity. By the time I finished, the decision was locked in. Not emotionally, but procedurally. No one could override it without legal consequences. No one could reinterpret it as implied consent. No one could step into my silence and call it love. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, because the decision point had passed, and on the other side of it, I wasn't angry, I wasn't triumphant. I was grounded. Some choices change outcomes. Others change who holds the pen. This one did both. Once the decision was made, there was nothing left to explain. That was the strange thing about it. I had spent so much of my life clarifying, reassuring, softening my words so others wouldn't feel unsettled. Now, with the most consequential choice behind me, there was no urge to speak at all. Action didn't require an announcement. I continued preparing for surgery as planned. I attended appointments. I nodded when the information was reviewed. I let my spouse believe that everything was proceeding exactly as expected. In a way, it was, just not in the way they assumed. Moving in silence doesn't mean moving secretly. It means moving without emotional leakage, without the need for validation, without inviting interference. I confirmed that my advance directive was uploaded into the hospital's system. I asked how conflicts between documents were resolved. I made sure mine was the most recent, and therefore the controlling one. I verified that the designated decision maker had been notified and had accepted the role. I checked that the nursing staff understood which document governed care. No drama, no confrontation, just alignment. At home, I didn't change my tone. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't act cold or distant. That would have raised questions. Instead, I stayed exactly as I had always been. People rarely notice silence when it's consistent with who they believe you are. What changed was invisible. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped seeking reassurance. I stopped asking for permission to ask questions. When my spouse said, "Everything's handled," I didn't respond with relief or gratitude. I simply said, "Okay." That single word did a lot of work. It closed conversations without affirming assumptions. It created space without confrontation. I began to understand that silence isn't the absence of power, it's often the container for it. The days leading up to the surgery felt surreal in their normalcy. Friends sent messages wishing me luck. Coworkers commented on how calm I seemed. My spouse told others how proud they were of my strength. No one suspected that the foundation beneath those narratives had shifted. I had expected to feel tension, anxiety, some residual fear. Instead, I felt clear, because for the first time, I knew that if something went wrong, my voice would not be replaced by someone else's interpretation of what was best. That knowledge changed everything. On the morning of the surgery, as I changed into the hospital gown, a nurse asked a routine question about my directives. I answered simply. She checked the file. She nodded. "Everything's in order," she said. I believed her. When my spouse squeezed my hand before I was taken back, there was genuine concern in their eyes. Affection, familiarity. I didn't doubt that they cared for me. But care and authority are not the same thing. As I was wheeled down the hallway, the same soft lighting passing overhead. I felt no need to review my choices, no urge to second guess. Moving in silence had allowed me to act without interference. And now the movement was complete. If I woke up, I would wake up on my own terms. If I didn't, my absence would not be managed according to someone else's convenience or fear. That was the quiet power of what I had done. And no one noticed a thing. I survived the operation. That sentence sounds simple, but it carries weight I didn't understand until much later. I woke up slowly, the way people describe in fragments. Light first, sound second, sensation last. My body felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else and I was only visiting. When my eyes finally opened fully, a nurse noticed and smiled. She spoke to me directly, used my name, asked how I was feeling. That alone felt different, not comforting, orienting. There was no dramatic moment of revelation in the recovery room, no immediate confrontation, just the steady awareness that I was alive, conscious, and still in possession of my voice. But somewhere outside that room, the consequences of my silence had already begun. I didn't know it yet. I wouldn't for a while. What I did notice was a subtle shift in the energy around me once my spouse arrived. Relief, yes, but also something else, a kind of disorientation, like someone arriving at a destination only to realize the map they were following no longer applied. They asked how I was. I answered honestly but briefly. Fine, tired, aware. There was a pause after that last word. Over the next day, small things started to surface. A nurse asked to confirm decision-making authority again. This time, she didn't look at my spouse when she spoke. She looked at me. My spouse corrected her automatically. I'm listed. The nurse checked the file and shook her head gently. Not anymore. It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. I watched my spouse's expression change, not into anger, but into confusion. A quiet recalculation. Must be a mistake, they said, half to me, half to the room. I didn't respond, because this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the first moment they felt a loss they couldn't name. Over the next few days, similar moments stacked. Requests that used to be routed through them now came to me. Updates that had once been summarized were delivered directly. Decisions that were previously assumed required confirmation. Not because anyone was punishing them, but because the structure had changed. And structures don't explain themselves. I could feel their discomfort growing, not as fear, but as displacement. A role they had inhabited confidently had been quietly revoked. They tried to regain footing the only way they knew how, by asking questions. Did you change something? Why are they asking you instead of me? Is there some kind of error in the paperwork? Each question carried the same underlying assumption, that this was temporary, fixable, an oversight. I answered calmly. I put my preferences on file. That was all. No accusation, no elaboration. Just a fact. They nodded, as if that explained it. As if preferences were something decorative, adjustable. But the consequences kept unfolding. Conversations they weren't included in. Decisions they were informed of, not consulted on. A growing awareness that their access to my inner life and my medical authority had changed. And because I wasn't angry, because I wasn't confrontational, they couldn't frame themselves as the injured party. There was nothing to argue against. Loss without drama is unsettling. There's no clear place to direct the feeling, no villain to push back against. I watched as my spouse struggled not with guilt, but with irrelevance, not being needed in the way they expected, not being deferred to, not being the default. This wasn't revenge. It was the natural outcome of clarity. And clarity, once enacted, doesn't ask for permission. There's a particular kind of panic that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't shout, it doesn't slam doors. It shows up as urgency wrapped in reason, as concerns framed as cooperation, as sudden interest in details that were once dismissed as unnecessary. That's how it began. My spouse started asking questions, not casually, not confidently, but with a careful edge. Questions about forms, about timelines, about why certain decisions are now required my direct confirmation. They framed it as confusion, as a system error, as bureaucracy gone wrong. Maybe something got filed incorrectly, they said more than once. We should probably get this sorted out. Sorted out, as if something had been misplaced. I listened. I let them speak. I noticed how the language shifted from we to I, from shared process to personal inconvenience. What they were experiencing wasn't fear for my health. I could see that clearly now. It was the fear of losing standing, of no longer being positioned as the intermediary, the one whose judgment was trusted without question. They hadn't realized how much of their identity had been built on that access. They tried gently at first to re enter the role. They offered to speak to the doctors, to handle updates, to manage logistics, all the things they had always done. Except now those offers were declined politely. Not by me, by the system. And systems are difficult to negotiate with once the rules are clear. I could see the realization settling in slowly. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with a conversation. There was no manager to speak to, no emotional appeal that could override documentation. The authority they'd assumed was provisional had been quietly revoked. They tried a different approach then. Concern. Why didn't you tell me? I thought we trusted each other. I was just trying to do what was best. Those statements were delivered softly, carefully, as if volume might change the outcome. I didn't argue with them because this wasn't about intention. It was about precedent. I answered once and only once. I needed to be certain my voice wouldn't be replaced. That was all. There was nothing else to explain. You can't undo a pattern by insisting it meant well. You can't fix a structural breach with reassurance. And they were beginning to understand that. I saw it in the way they hovered at the edges of conversations now, in the way they waited for cues that never came, in the way they asked for inclusion instead of assuming it. It was too late for those adjustments, not because I was unforgiving, but because trust doesn't reset on command. It rebuilds slowly, if at all, and only when the underlying assumptions change. They wanted to go back to how things were, but how things were depended on my silence, and my silence was no longer available. There's a quiet grief in realizing that your access to someone was conditional, that it existed only as long as they remained compliant. I think my spouse was grieving that loss, even if they couldn't name it. They weren't angry with me. They were destabilized by the fact that I no longer fit the role they'd organized their behavior around. And roles, once disrupted, don't snap back into place. They asked if we could talk it through once I was home. I agreed, not because I thought it would change anything, but because clarity doesn't fear conversation. Still, some things had already become irreversible. The document couldn't be undone by an apology. The authority couldn't be reclaimed by intent. The awareness, mine or theirs, couldn't be put back. By the time we left the hospital, it was clear to both of us. Whatever repair was possible, it would not include a return to the old dynamic. And for the first time, that didn't frighten me. The conversation happened a week after I came home, not because either of us had been avoiding it, but because recovery has its own pace, and I wanted my body steady before my words were. We sat at the kitchen table in the evening, the same place where paperwork had once been spread out and decisions were narrated to me. This time, there were no documents, no props, just two people facing the truth without intermediaries. My spouse spoke first. "I need to understand why you didn't tell me," they said. Not angrily, carefully, as if volume might determine outcome. I looked at them and realized something important. This wasn't a trial. There was no verdict to deliver, no point to prove. So I answered plainly, because telling you wouldn't have changed what I needed to do. That landed quietly. They took a breath. "I was trying to protect you." "I know," I said, and I meant it. Protection, I had learned, can coexist with erasure. One does not cancel out the other. "I didn't feel protected," I continued. "I felt managed." That word did something. I saw it register. Not defensively, internally. They started to explain how overwhelmed they'd been, how scared, how they thought making decisions quickly was the responsible thing to do. I let them finish. Then I said, "At no point did you ask me what I wanted if things went wrong." There was no accusation in my voice, just a statement. They opened their mouth, then closed them. Silence filled the space between us. Not the old kind, where I absorbed discomfort, but a new kind. Shared, unavoidable. "I didn't think," they began. "I know," I said again. "That's the problem." The confrontation didn't escalate because there was nothing to escalate toward. I wasn't seeking remorse. I wasn't asking for reassurance. I wasn't negotiating a compromise. I was stating boundaries that had already been enforced. "I'm not angry," I told them, "but I'm not willing to return to a dynamic where my presence is mistaken for consent." They asked if I trusted them. I thought about the question before answering. "I trust you to care," I said. "I don't trust you to decide for me." That distinction mattered. Trust is not a single object. It's contextual, specific, earned differently in different domains. They nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. We talked for a long time. About patterns, about assumptions, about how easy it is to confuse familiarity with understanding. There were moments of sadness, of regret, but no heat, no explosion. Because anger would have implied I was still asking them to change. I wasn't. I was informing them that I already had. By the end of the conversation, nothing was resolved in the way people expect resolutions to look. There was no promise to do better, no dramatic apology, just a mutual awareness that the relationship had crossed a threshold and would now exist under different terms, if it continued at all. And oddly, that honesty felt like relief. For the first time, I wasn't managing anyone else's emotional experience. I wasn't cushioning the truth to make it easier to accept. I had said what needed to be said, and I was done speaking. Who I am now is not louder than who I was. That surprises people when they expect transformation to arrive with visible force. New boundaries spoken sharply, a different tone of voice, a rebranded personality. None of that happened. What changed was internal, and therefore permanent. I no longer measure myself by how easy I am to live with. I no longer confuse calm with consent or endurance with virtue. I no longer assume that being loved means being accurately represented. Those were lessons learned quietly, but they rewrote everything. I still speak gently. I still listen carefully. I still move through the world without unnecessary noise. But the silence I carry now has structure inside it. It's not empty. It's not available to be filled by other people's assumptions. I'm clearer about what belongs to me, my time, my body, my authority. And clarity, I've learned, doesn't require performance. In my marriage, or what remains of it, things are slower now, more deliberate. There are fewer assumptions and more explicit questions. Whether that will be enough, I don't yet know. And for the first time, I'm not rushing to decide. Not everything needs immediate resolution. What matters is that I no longer disappear inside other people's certainty. At work, something subtle has shifted too. I still do my job well. I'm still reliable, but I don't absorb dysfunction quietly anymore. When decisions affect me, I ask to be included early, not defensively, not emotionally, just clearly. And when I sense myself being assigned a role I didn't agree to, I don't rush to perform it. I pause. That pause has become my most powerful tool. It gives people the chance to correct themselves. And if they don't, it gives me the information I need. I'm no longer interested in being underestimated, not because I need to prove anything, but because underestimation thrives on ambiguity, and ambiguity no longer benefits me. The experience didn't harden me. It refined me. I don't walk around suspicious or guarded. I don't assume bad intent, but I no longer outsource my safety to trust alone. Trust is now something I verify with structure. That shift has brought an unexpected peace. Not the peace of being accommodated, but the peace of being sovereign. I know now that agency isn't something you assert once and keep forever. It's something you maintain, quietly, consistently, without apology. And I know that love, real love, does not require you to be small in moments that matter most. I am still the woman people describe as calm. They're not wrong, but calm, I've learned, can coexist with boundaries that don't bend. And that is who I am now. There's a temptation, when a story ends without shouting or spectacle, to ask what the point was. No one was exposed publicly. No one was humiliated. No one got what they deserved in the dramatic sense people often expect. And yet, everything changed. This story isn't a warning about marriage or medicine or even trust on its own. It's about something quieter and more universal. How easily agency can slip away when we're praised for being agreeable, strong, and low maintenance, especially when we are calm, especially when we are reliable, especially when people believe they already know what we would choose. What happened to me didn't begin with betrayal. It began with an assumption, with the idea that closeness replaces consent, that love replaces verification, that silence means alignment. It doesn't. Silence is just silence, until someone decides what it means for you. The hardest truth I had to accept wasn't that my spouse signed something without my knowledge. It was that I had made it easy for others to believe my voice wasn't necessary in moments that mattered most. Not intentionally, not foolishly, gradually. Agency is rarely taken in one dramatic moment. It's usually surrendered in small, reasonable increments. Each one is easy to justify. Each one is survivable. Until suddenly the stakes are no longer abstract. I survived the surgery, but survival wasn't the victory. The real turning point was waking up and understanding that my life had been quietly negotiable in a room I wasn't fully present in, and deciding that would never happen again. There is no moral here about punishing people who overstep. This isn't about revenge or retribution. It's about responsibility, about recognizing that if you are consistently calm, people will begin to rely on that calm to carry their discomfort, their fear, and sometimes their authority. And unless you intervene clearly, structurally, deliberately, your silence will be used to complete decisions you never agreed to make. Quiet dominance isn't about control over others. It's about authorship over yourself. It's about choosing when to speak, when to pause, and when to let systems, not emotions, do the work of protecting you. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. Being loved is not the same as being represented. Being trusted is not the same as being consulted. And being calm does not mean you are expendable. Your voice matters most precisely when it's inconvenient. Before I end, I want to ask you something, not rhetorically, but genuinely. Have you ever realized, maybe too late, that someone had been making decisions about you instead of with you? If you're comfortable, I'd like you to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments, not to relive pain, but to make it visible. Because these stories don't become safer when they're hidden, they become safer when they're named. Thank you for listening.